come and give your life to Christ. And I'm going to ask you to come and stand right here in front, quietly and reverently.
Billy Graham was a statesman for the church and also for the nation. He represented evangelical Christianity and Christianity as a whole when he went to other places around the globe, starting with his friendship with President Eisenhower, would, on his way to, let's say, to India, would go by the White House and say, I'm going to India. Are there any messages that you would like for me to convey? Would you like for me to speak to Prime Minister Nehru? Perhaps you could arrange for my speaking to Prime Minister Nehru. And he was able to do that. And when he came back to the United States, he would typically go by the White House and say, this is what I observed. Starting in the late 70s and going on through to the early 1990s, he began starting first in Hungary and then moving gradually to other countries and finally to Moscow. He was able to preach, starting with little churches or little private gatherings, mostly private gatherings, unannounced, till finally he was carried in some countries on state television. And in these, he was certainly just preaching the evangelical gospel that he'd preached all of his life. But he would make a point of talking to the leaders in these countries, and many of which he developed strong friendships with. And he would tell them, Americans value religious freedom very greatly. You will always have trouble in dealing with America as long as you are repressing the religious freedom of the people in your country. He would also tell them that you have far more believers, Christian, Jews, Muslims, than you have atheists belonging to the Communist Party. You must take care not to oppress these people. They are good citizens. You do not need to fear the fact that they are also believers. And then he would tell the religious people, the Christian people, particularly in those countries, here's an argument you can use. If you have given this Baptist preacher from North Carolina the right to hold these meetings, then why don't you give it to us, good citizens? And some of their people said, we are giving them this argument and they are using it. And so I think that Billy Graham played, certainly not the only role, but a significant role in enlarging the scope of religious freedom throughout the former Soviet Union. One of the most notable things about Billy Graham, of course, is that he managed, as no other person has ever done, to befriend and serve as a counselor and pastor to close to a dozen presidents, every president since President Eisenhower in the 1950s, although he was closer to some than to others. But he served them in a number of ways. For some, with Eisenhower being notable, and I think the Bushes being notable, he served as a pastor, sometimes dealing with them on questions that were very simple questions that they didn't have anyone else to ask, perhaps, or didn't want to ask anyone else. Dwight Eisenhower asked him a couple of times, including when he was on his deathbed, how can I know that I'm going to heaven? Lyndon Johnson asked him, will I see my mother and father in heaven after I die? He is noted, of course, for having played a role in helping George W. Bush to straighten up his life and to live a more righteous life with respect to alcohol and other things. Bill and Hillary Clinton talk about during the times of their marital troubles while he was in the White House, that he talked to Bill Clinton about asking for forgiveness, repenting, genuinely seeking it, and also, importantly, something that hadn't come out until recently, talking with Hillary Clinton and telling her, I know how hard this is for you, but you must also learn to forgive. He treated them as another person, a person who needed a pastor. He had those friendships, he had a pastoral relationship with them, and of course, it was beneficial to the presidents and it was beneficial to him. Early on, he coveted the approval of President Truman, making something of an embarrassment of himself in the way that he kept trying to get President Truman to come to his 1952 crusade in Washington, when Truman refused because of an earlier meeting they'd had, and he thought Graham had tried to make too much capital out of it. He thought Graham was really a phony. Later on, they made up. But beginning with Eisenhower and others, he wanted their approval. He wanted to be seen with them. And then it became clear that it was an advantage to the presidents to have him as their friend. If a president was a friend of Billy Graham, then people watching might say, well, then the president must be a good man if he's Billy Graham's friend. He may even be a Christian man. And that means his policies must be good policies, perhaps even Christian policies, or Billy Graham wouldn't be his friend. And so we can support that man. That, of course, just by his being there, without ever saying, I support this or that, certainly lent an air of respectability and honor to the presidents. When he became nationally and then internationally known, the fundamentalists thought of him as one of them and were very proud of him, that here's one of us, a man who's trained in some of our best schools, is representing us and is now one of the most famous preachers in the world. So they were very proud of him for a long time. But then a crucial break came in 1957 when he was holding his great crusade in New York City, which lasted all summer long.
Going to ask that nobody leave the garden. Now I'm going to ask you to get up out of your seat, hundreds of you, men, women, young people. Come. Whole families need to come together. Sweethearts can come together.
It made him a national figure in a way that he had not been before, even though certainly he was well known. The crucial thing here was that he accepted the invitation to preach there from the Protestant Council of Churches, which was associated with the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, which many fundamentalists thought were also associated with the Antichrist. And they thought, if Billy Graham is going to associate with them, then we can't have anything more to do with him. And he told them politely but firmly that he was not going to let them make that decision, that he was going to accept the invitation of anybody who asked him, as long as they didn't try to trim his message. If they didn't try to control what he was going to say, he was going anywhere he could to preach that gospel. And some of the main leaders of that time, the fundamentalist leaders, said, we're not going to have anything else to do with Billy Graham. And indeed, they persisted in that. And early in his ministry, the people who were likely to criticize his coming to town were perhaps the Unitarians or maybe some of the more liberal Presbyterians. After that, it came that the people who were most likely to protest Billy Graham's coming to town and maybe picketing outside his crusades, as I have seen on a number of occasions, were fundamentalists who thought Billy Graham had just gone too far, that he wasn't sound any longer. And it's been said even that the way to distinguish between fundamentalists and evangelicals are that evangelicals are people who like Billy Graham and the fundamentalists are people who don't. He understood that all of us are subject to temptation and that we need to have help in avoiding it. And the crucial thing came in 1948 in Modesto, California. His ministry had still not become nationwide in any significant sense. But he called his close associates together, Cliff Barrows and George Beverly Shea, who stayed with him throughout his long career, and his old friend Grady Wilson, and said, boys, it looks like God may have something special planned for us, and we need to be careful that we don't make the mistakes that have brought other ministries throughout the decades to shipwreck. Let's go back to our rooms and make a list of the things that can cause us trouble, and then we'll come back in a little while and talk about it. Well, the lists they made were pretty commonplace. Sex, money, exaggerating their statistics, and criticizing the local preachers in order to build themselves up. They took concrete steps to avoid those. With respect to sex, it became a rule that none of them were to be in a room with a woman other than their wives or daughter. If they were in their office, the door was to be open. That kept them from a lot of quite possible temptation. With respect to money, the money was in the hands of a local committee, and a full accounting was printed in the largest newspaper after the crusade. Billy Graham put himself on a salary that was much smaller than he could have gotten by what were called love offerings, the collections taken up at the end of crusades to reward the minister. He put himself under the guidance, and this was really crucial, he put himself under the guidance of a board that included very substantial business, political, religious leaders, and not just himself, his wife, his lawyer, and a few hangers-on that would always do what he wanted to. And that board over the years have told him no. I mean, most of the time, of course, they did what he wanted to do, but they have told him no. We don't have the money to do that. You've stepped out too far. With respect to statistics, it was said of evangelists that they spoke evangelistically speaking, which meant they sometimes counted arms and legs instead of heads. But they decided they would always take the official count as it was given by the police or whoever estimated the size of crowds, even though sometimes they knew their crowds were actually larger. And instead of criticizing the local preachers, they agreed to cooperate with them, to feed the people who came forward at their meetings into local churches, and not to try to say, well, your local preacher's not doing a good job, you stick with me and we'll give you the true gospel. Always trying to encourage the local preachers and holding training sessions for the local preachers in local evangelism, doing things to build up the churches. So in all of those ways, he endeared himself to the churches that were cooperating, and also protected himself from the kinds of problems that have caused other ministries to fail.
Don't ever say it's a white man's religion or a black man's religion. It's a world religion. He belongs to the world.
Well, Billy Graham's role in dealing with racial problems has been, I think, it's come to be understood somewhat, but he played a greater role, particularly among his own constituency, than is sometimes recognized. He grew up in the South and in North Carolina and largely accepted the mores of segregation at that time, but soon came to feel this isn't right, as many young Southerners come to feel, but he had an opportunity to do something about it. But in 1953 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a watershed moment, he went down and personally removed the ropes that separated the white and the colored sections. And members of the committee told him, you mustn't do that. This will be disastrous. And he said, if we don't do this, I won't preach. It's not clear how many people made note of it, but certainly many blacks did note it. And within a year or so, Billy Graham refused to have any kind of segregated services at any other time, and throughout his long ministry, and later on made points to have African American leaders as part of his crusade committees and so forth. In 1957, at his summer-long crusade in Madison Square Garden, he not only made a special effort to try to figure out how they could draw more blacks to the crusade, but he brought Martin Luther King to New York. At the time, he was leading the marches and other movements in the South and Montgomery, and Billy Graham had Dr. King talk to his organization about how they could be more effective, but he also invited him to lead prayer at the service, saying that he's leading a great social movement in the South, and we're happy to have him here. And by King's appearing on the program, Dr. King was saying, Billy Graham is our friend. Now, many people, particularly in the South, drew away from Billy Graham at that time, just said that this is going too far. When Martin Luther King was becoming more confrontational, he backed off a little bit. Billy Graham never liked conflict. He didn't like confrontation. He was a little bit distressed with some of the things Dr. King was doing, particularly those that had landed him in jail. He was fond of quoting that Martin Luther King had told him, you stay in the stadiums, I'll stay in the streets. You can do more good there than you could if you came into the streets. But he still didn't like to ruffle things up. He didn't like conflict. But I think it's important to recognize that although Billy Graham was never in front of the parade, he was always in front of his unit and he was always moving forward. So he was pulling the people with whom he had the most influence to say, this is unjust, this is unchristian, and we must move past it. Billy Graham's career is a mountain range with many, many peaks, but of course some do stand out higher than others. He really broke on the national scene in 1949 in Los Angeles. He was holding a revival there that was doing okay. It was getting a good bit of publicity, but it was about to close down and had been, you would say, successful, but not overwhelming. And one night he came to the tent, and there were photographers and reporters all around, and he was wondering, what in the world has happened? And a reporter tore off a piece of paper, or handed him a piece of paper that had been torn off of a teletype machine, and said, look at this. And it just had two words on it, Puff Graham. That was a directive from William Randolph Hearst Jr., who was the head, of course, of the Hearst papers, and he was telling his editors, give Billy Graham a great deal of publicity. The next day, Billy Graham and his crusade were on the front pages of the Hearst newspapers, very quickly picked up by the United Press, Associated Press, other new wire services. A few months later, Henry Luce put time in life at the service of Billy Graham, giving him a great deal more attention. The next big step that all of the people in his organization will always point to is a 1954 crusade in Haringey Arena in London. When he went to England, he faced a barrage of criticism. He had made some statements criticizing the Labour Party and what he was calling socialist policies, and that drew criticism, and some said, just stay home. But he won their hearts. He filled Haringey Arena for week after week, and that was a milestone ministry that made him really, certainly in Europe, an international figure, and filtered back to the United States to see that our boy Billy Graham is doing very well over there across the sea. The next great highlight came in 1957 when he rented Madison Square Garden and preached every night from May 15th to Labor Day, filled it virtually every night during that period, filled Yankee Stadium, filled Times Square for a great closing ceremony with more than 100,000 people gathered. It was during that crusade that ABC television started broadcasting his Saturday night services nationwide, and he was doing very well in the ratings against Perry Como and Jackie Gleason. And that encouraged him then to keep television as a major part of his ministry. It's notable that in 1995 he could be heard throughout the world preaching from San Juan, Puerto Rico, broadcast to 185 countries with an audience of 1 billion people estimated. And I think that would have to be counted as, certainly as a highlight. We sometimes think of Billy Graham as larger than life, and indeed he was in many senses. But in a real sense, one of the things that made him stand out was that even though you knew he was one of the most famous people in the world, a person who had received as much publicity as almost any person who ever lived, and yet he seemed like a regular person. Even though he was the friend of the Queen and prime ministers and presidents and leaders around the world, he still seemed to think of himself as a small-town boy who was surprised that anyone would take an interest in him. Billy Graham, of course, was a person of considerable ambition. Even when he was in college, his professors would say that they knew he wanted to do something big, even though he didn't know quite what that might be. And when he was a very young evangelist, 20, 21 years old, he held a crusade, and he had a banner that's saying, "Come and hear Billy Graham, one of America's great young evangelists," when he wasn't yet one of America's great evangelists. He had that ambition, but it was mixed with a genuine humility, and they were in a conscious tension. I think that perhaps one of the most telling things that was said about him by people who knew him very well, a number of people said things like, you can split Billy Graham all the way down and you won't find any falseness in him. But his photographer, Russ Busby, who traveled with him for decades and probably knew him as well and had watched him in as many situations as any other human, maybe even more than his wife, said, it takes a big ego to be a big preacher. And Billy has an ego, but he keeps it under control. If it gets out of control, he brings it back under control. And I'm not talking about weeks, I'm talking about a day or two. But a big difference between him and some of these other big preachers that have gotten into trouble is that if God has something to say to him, at least he can get his attention. I spent a good bit of time with Billy Graham in working on the book, and I was able to see him in many public situations and spent a number of days and many hours with him talking. But I think of all the moments, and of course there were many things to remember, but of all the moments that stick with me as much as anything else was a very poignant moment. I had saved talking with him about his relationship with the presidents, particularly Richard Nixon, until the last, because I knew there would be some things there that would be uncomfortable. And I had found in the Nixon archives a number of memos, directives, phone records, talking points that were designed to, frankly, they were designed to see how can we use Billy Graham. Here's what we need to get Billy to do. Here are the questions we need to ask him. Here's the information we need to feed him. And they were looked at with an objective eye. You could tell they were using him. Charles Colson said to me, of course we were using him. That's what we did. We used everybody. But Billy Graham was, because he's not that kind of person, was really surprised to see those things. And we talked about them. I showed him the memos, and he said, I knew what I'd said to the president, and I knew what he had said to me. But when I saw all of those memos that had been circulating in the background, I felt like a sheep led to the slaughter. Billy Graham's legacy is many-faceted. First of all, of course, you have the both counted and uncountable number of people who were influenced by his preaching of the Christian gospel message and who either became Christians for the first time or became stronger Christians as a result of being associated with his ministry and listening to his message in person and through television and in other ways. He established in 1956 Christianity Today magazine, which became the flagship magazine of evangelical Christianity. That led, of course, to his great impact on bringing the evangelical movement, which was real but which was rather small and disjointed, and serving a key role in bringing it together so that now it is the most vibrant part, or certainly argues for being the most vibrant part of Christianity in this country and worldwide. And he played a role in that cannot be overestimated. But perhaps his greatest legacy will be that people will look upon this famous man who stuck to what he was doing, being an evangelist, not letting too many other things get in the way of that, and who did it without scandal, who managed to maintain integrity for more than 6 decades of public ministry. And I think at the end, a good epitaph for him would be that this was, as Scripture says, a workman who needeth not to be ashamed.
For more information on this or our other programs, please visit www.bakerinstitute.org.